So today we're going to look at the differences between neurotransmitters and hormones. We're also going to look at lipophilic versus hydrophilic hormones and how G protein coupled receptors and second messenger systems operate. As you can recall from our previous lecture on the nervous system, axons of neurons secrete chemical messengers called neurotransmitters into the synaptic clefts. These chemicals then diffuse across the synaptic cleft and they bind to receptors on the postsynaptic cell. And so synaptic transmission generally only affects the postsynaptic cell directly that receives the neurotransmitter. And so these neurotransmitters only travel a very short distance. Whereas a hormone is a regulatory chemical that's secreted into the extracellular fluid and then carried by blood. Therefore, it can act at a distance from its source. Endocrine glands are organs that are specialized to secrete hormones. And then some organs, such as the liver and the kidney, can also produce hormones in addition to their other functions. And so hormones need to be stable in order to travel these large distances without being destroyed. And even though they do travel through the circulatory system, only targets with receptors that bind to these chemicals can respond to this signal. And then there are molecules that act both as circulating hormones and neurotransmitters, such as norepinephrine, which is secreted by the adrenal glands but also released as a neurotransmitter by the sympathetic nervous system, in addition to neurohormones that are produced by neurons but carried in the blood, such as antidiuretic hormone. And we refer to the organs and tissues that produce hormones collectively as the endocrine system. And we're going to discuss some of the specific components of the endocrine system in the next lecture. So this is just a diagram showing some of those components, but like I said, more details to follow in the next lecture. And we can categorize hormones by whether they're nonpolar or polar. The nonpolar or lipophilic or fat-soluble hormones are the steroid hormones and hormones secreted by the thyroid. Now, since these hormones are not water-soluble, they're found in the blood bound to transport proteins. And these hormones actually move into the target cell and bind to intracellular receptors. Now, the other hormones are hydrophilic or water-soluble, and so they're soluble in blood, so they don't require a transport protein to go from where they're secreted to the site of action. And these water-soluble hormones do not move into the target cells. They instead bind to receptors that are located in the cell membrane of the target cell. And here we're seeing a comparison of both hydrophilic and lipophilic hormones, and that they're both transported to targets through the blood, but the lipophilic hormones bind to transport proteins, which makes them soluble in blood. And when we get to the target cells, we see that the target cells for hydrophilic hormones have membrane receptors, and the lipophilic hormones bind receptors inside the cells, or intracellular receptors. And both types of hormones are eventually destroyed or cleared from the blood by the liver or the kidney, but hydrophilic hormones are usually deactivated more rapidly than lipophilic hormones. And then what that results in is that hydrophilic hormones tend to act over a much more brief period of time, such as minutes to hours, whereas lipophilic hormones are generally active over prolonged periods, such as days or weeks. And here we see a generic example of lipophilic hormone action, where we see the hormone pass through the plasma membrane because it's lipophilic. It then binds to a receptor protein inside the target cell in the cytoplasm. That hormone receptor complex then moves into the nucleus, binding to a hormone response element on DNA that is involved in the regulation of gene transcription. That binding results in the transcription of mRNA, which then results in protein synthesis. And that change in protein synthesis, or the synthesis of that new protein is the cellular response to that lipophilic hormone. And hydrophilic hormones, on the other hand, do not cross the cell membrane. They instead bind to receptors on the cell membrane, such as a GPCR, or G protein coupled receptor. So what then takes place is the hormone signal is transduced by that cell surface receptor, resulting in the activation of a second messenger molecule. And that small intracellular second messenger molecule is involved in furthering the activation of the cellular response. Well, here let's go ahead and take a closer look at a second messenger system example, more of a generic example. So we see a G protein coupled receptor, which is going to bind the hydrophilic hormone. The binding of the hormone results in the activation of the G protein when GDP is replaced by GTP, which, by the way, is guanine diphosphate versus guanine triphosphate. The active G protein, in turn, then activates an enzyme whose job is to generate the second messenger. And that second messenger molecule then activates a protein kinase. And that protein kinase, in turn, phosphorylates an additional intracellular protein. That phosphorylation is going to either activate or deactivate the function of that intracellular protein, and this will result in the cellular response. And so, like I said, this was just a generic kind of example of the potential moving parts in a GPCR second messenger system. We'll probably take a look at a slightly more specific example in the next lecture. So today we looked at some differences between neurotransmitters and hormones, such as the mode of transport, the distance in which they generally travel, and also the target cells that are affected by those two different types of molecules. And we took a look at some differences and similarities between lipophilic and hydrophilic hormones, including the way that they travel through the circulatory system, the types of receptors involved, whether they're membrane-bound or intracellular, and also the duration of action that's typically seen in those two different types of hormones. And then we also took a look at some of the moving parts in G protein-coupled receptors and second messenger systems.